Hi everyone, Ivan Zasimov here. I just wanted to talk about something that I just kind of been keeping up with lately. I don't know if anyone knows about the historian Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor. There's a British historian by the name of Tom Holland, and he writes a lot of books on sort of the late ancient world, the Middle Ages, and he's really one of my favorite historians. He writes at the popular level, but I still think he's just a really smart guy, an excellent writer, and someone just with some really original ideas, and just how he understands history is really interesting. He wrote a book that I read a couple years ago that's probably one of my favorite historical nonfiction books called In the Shadow of the Sword. And it's basically him trying to find the historical origins of Islam. By that I mean, if you don't believe that Muhammad was in a cave and he actually got a revelation from the angel Gabriel and this is how Islam gets started, well, then how does Islam get started? That is what Tom Holland was trying to figure out in that book, and it's really interesting. The thesis, from what I can remember, is that he doesn't think Islam actually starts in the Arabian Peninsula. He thinks it starts kind of in modern day Syria or Palestine, or um, sort of on the borders of the Byzantine and Persian empires, and it's this kind of mix of Messianic Judaism, Gnostic Christian heresies, classical Greek paganism, and Zoroastrianism. It's a really interesting idea, and he got a lot of controversy for it because, oh no, like, you're offending Muslims because, you're saying that their prophet wasn't really a prophet, which, I mean, it's just self-evident. If you're gonna think that Muhammad was an actual prophet, you'd be Muslim. So that's, if you're not a Muslim, obviously you don't think Muhammad was an actual prophet. Um, but he's written some other really interesting books on the Middle Ages. He wrote a really good book, I think, is it called Millennium? Something like that, that I read on the 11th century and how basically the rise of papal dominance in Western Europe and how he thinks this sort of led to the rise of Western civilization and Western dominance and things, for example, like the popes in the 11th century um, basically start the idea of separation of church and state or carry it forward by stopping secular kings and secular princes from choosing or electing bishops. All that is in the hands of the church, and this sort of separates state and religious power, which is really interesting. But anyway, he has a new book out now called Dominion, which I haven't read yet, but I've been listening to a lot of interviews that he's kind of been on the book circuit, talking about his new book. He had a debate with A.C. Grayling, who's one of these British new atheist types. That was really interesting. And the thesis of this book is how Christianity shapes the Western imagination, specifically the idea that Christianity gives that the weak, there's a certain strength in being a victim. There's a certain strength in persecution and in suffering that Jesus displayed on the cross that was just unheard of in the classical pagan world. So for example, if before Jesus, if you were to say that, I'm victorious because I suffered and died on a cross, that would be insane. This is the most ridiculous thing. But with Christianity, in light of the resurrection, the cross becomes a symbol of hope and a symbol of life. And he claims that this is just, this was an absolutely earth shattering revolution in the history of how the West thought. And, he claims it just has its effects just rippled out into things obviously like the Reformation, obviously Christendom, but also in things like international law and certain liberal values and things like that. It's a really interesting, really fascinating argument that he's putting forward. Obviously, is he the first person to claim that Christianity shapes the West? Obviously not. But I think what makes this interesting is that Tom Holland was an atheist. I mean, he's apparently stated he's becoming more religious now. But when he starts this book and when he starts thinking about these things, he's an atheist. He's secular. He's not a hostile atheist, but he didn't believe in Christianity. And it's really refreshing as a Christian. I seem to get more out of how Tom Holland has been explaining the faith recently than a lot of Christians are, because this is a guy who's just exploring it in such a fresh new way. And this is a guy who knows the historical background of the period, and he understands how revolutionary Christianity was in, first century Roman Empire. So I think that's really interesting. But there was a debate, not a debate, a podcast, an interview he had. Someone named Peter. His name was James Delingpole. It was a podcast. He had an interview with James Delingpole, and he was talking about how Christianity led to our conception of universal human rights, the idea that all people are equal, at a fundamental level, they're all equal before God. And he said even, this sort of woke academic of today, in their own distorted way, they're only taking over Christian assumptions. The idea that every human being is created equal. The idea that the weak and the poor are deserving of special, they're supposed to be given special care and sort of special status in our society. This is something that's just alien to a lot of cultures. Even the idea of secular society, the division between religious and secular. This is something that begins with a Christian view of politics. This is not how the pagans viewed the world. This is not how a lot of Muslims view the world today. This is not how a lot of other cultures outside of Christianity view the world, that there is supposed to be a sort of division between the sacred and the secular. But he said something that struck me as very interesting when he was talking about the Nazis. And Holland believes, as I do, and a lot of people do, maybe it's something I'll make in a video because I think it's kind of fascinating. He thinks that Nazism and fascism is a sort of return to paganism. And by that, I guess kind of a side rant, like I personally don't consider, I don't consider Francisco Franco a fascist. I don't like Francisco Franco. I still think he was authoritarian and a dictator, but I don't think he was fascist in the same way that Mussolini and Hitler were. Personally, the only regimes that I like to call fascist are Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. Obviously, that's very contentious. Again, maybe I can go and make a video on that sometime. But basically, I think fascism is a return to a pagan view of warfare. It's a return to a pagan view of violence. It's a return to a pagan view of, the strong doing what they can and the weak doing what they must. A certain kind of pagan worldview that was very prominent in places like Sparta and Imperial Rome. And what Holland brought up was very interesting. He's saying, the modern obsession with Nazism. You look at how so many people today are just so quick to call everyone a fascist, and you look at something like Antifa, where even the most mainstream reasonable conservatives like Ben Shapiro are called fascist, right? Or, Trump is called a Nazi, right? I mean, just the fascist is the worst thing you can call someone. What Holland argues is it's sort of a holdover from a Christian point of view, because the Nazis very deliberately said that human beings are not fundamentally equal. They very deliberately said the weak should just be discarded because they're not strong enough to survive in our new society. They very consciously rejected the Christian roots of Europe. When they went into European tradition. See, this is what annoys me when a lot of left wingers talk about fascism. See, are they traditional? Well, they were traditional, but in a weird kind of way, not in a way that someone like Edmund Burke was, or the way that Metternich was. They were going back to this weird fictionalized history of the Aryan peoples. They're pulling back into the pre-Christian roots of Europe. They're very self-consciously repudiating the Christian legacy of the West. And so anyway, what Tom Holland is saying is, why are we so worried about Nazis? Why are we so obsessed with the evils of Nazism? He says, because as much as we want to move away from Christianity, Nazism represents what happens when you so self-consciously repudiate the Christian ideas of all human beings being made in the image and likeness of God. And everyone understands at a deep level, as much as they want to get away from Christianity, that if you just remove those Christian concepts from society, it will end up looking like the Nazis. It will end up looking like Auschwitz, or it will end up looking like even elements of Mussolini's Italy. This very harsh, domineering, racist society where we just divide people in terms of their strength or their class, and the people at the top are at the top and the people at the bottom, well, they just try not to get stamped on. And I thought that was very interesting. I never thought of it like that. That in our sort of sometimes hysterical repudiation of the legacy of the Nazis, we're sort of subliminally telling ourselves we don't want to move from Christian presuppositions about how society works, because if you do, this is what will happen. But then he said something even more interesting, is he said, well, people, particularly on the sort of academic woke left, they've just had this strategy for the past 20 years. Well, if someone says something that kind of goes against their liberal dogma, oh, you're a Nazi, oh, you're a fascist, oh, you're this, or you're a racist. And Tom Holland says there's a risk as we become sort of a post-Christian society. There's a risk when someone says you're a fascist, the person will respond, yeah, and. Because you don't have the theological basis for the equality of all human beings. I mean, this is something that this kind of gets to the heart of a lot of my problems with leftism, is they make these assumptions, as much as a lot of them despise Christianity, and particularly more traditional Christianity. They make assumptions about the equality of all human beings and how we have a responsibility to care for the poor and the marginalized in society. They make these suppositions that are deeply Christian. But the question is, if you want to repudiate the metaphysics on which those assumptions are founded, on what basis can you say all human beings are created equal? Because personally, I mean, I can't find a better explanation for the idea that all human beings are created equal outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition, out of the idea that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. Because, it's not immediately apparent that all human beings are equal. I mean, we know this. I mean, some people are more attractive, some people are smarter, some people are more physically strong, some people are more creative, some people are better politicians, some people make better leaders, some people aren't. And especially when you get to the case of people who have mental illnesses, people who have genetic disorders, people who are physically handicapped. I mean, from a pagan perspective, I mean, what did you do with handicapped children? What did you do with babies who weren't born healthy? I mean, what did the classical Greeks do? They just expose them to the elements and hope they die. I mean, Christianity is what changes all that by saying that because we're created in the image and likeness of God, and St. Paul pushes this further by saying in Christ, all human beings are fundamentally equal. There is no Jew or Greek. And once you get away from that, you lose you just lose the basis. You lose the solid basis for all human beings being equal. And, we already start to see this, with someone like Donald Trump. And, I hate this idea that, all Donald Trump supporters are racist or Donald Trump's a Nazi. But there was a significant subset of Trump voters that obviously were not fascist, obviously were not racist, but, and in some ways quite legitimately, got to a point where they no longer cared when someone called them fascist. They no longer, otherwise they wouldn't have voted for Trump because, while I don't think Trump is a fascist, he makes these kind of ridiculous statements. He clearly has a kind of authoritarian personality to him. He's vulgar. His treatment of women and it's just gross. And it's not that the people voting for him approved of all this, but they just kind of got to a point where, yeah, I don't care if you call me a fascist anymore. I just don't care. It doesn't work anymore. And within that significant subset, there was a subset within that subset, a very small subset, and its connections to Trump, I think, are very disputed and controversial, but I think it's there nonetheless. And then you have people like the alt-right, who, yeah, they basically say, you're a racist. Yeah, and what's wrong with that? And I think Tom Holland is right. As society moves away from, a kind of Christian culture, it's going to be more and more difficult for these sort of secular leftists to argue against these people because they don't have a kind of coherent grounding. Now, I don't think, it's always hard to predict these things, but I honestly don't think this is going to lead to some kind of, fascist takeover of the country or anything. Because again, I just think, as much as we want to move away from Christianity, we've just been saturated in these assumptions for so long. I think most Westerners will just not be able to stomach an outright fascist regime, barring some kind of severe economic downturn. But it is a point, and it gets to a deeper issue I have with left liberalism and just leftism in general. I remember Vaush, and Vaush is obviously not the model of intellectual sophistication, but Vaush, I forget what video I was watching with him, and he said, well, I think people generally want, his view on how politics should work. Well, people generally all want the same things. People generally want freedom. People generally want, people generally want to be equal and all this stuff. So, I think that my politics is the best way to get that. And I'm saying, well, no, they don't. It's patently obvious. Not all people want to be free. Go to the Islamic world, for instance. In Saudi Arabia, a lot of people get Saudi Arabia backwards. If you talk to Saudis, like when I had some Saudi friends when I went to college, they were from Saudi Arabia, and I used to ask them about how life was like over there. And they said, no, you don't understand, because a lot of people have this idea that the monarchy actively supports Wahhabism. But the reality is Wahhabism kind of keeps the monarchy hostage. The monarchy has to sort of support Wahhabism because it has to, or else it will fall. And in fact, a lot of the sort of rich elites in Saudi Arabia, yeah, they live a very decadent lifestyle. But you go to the sort of tribal areas in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, these are people who have been living for thousands, well, not thousands, but over 1,000 years in very tribal conditions, in highly patriarchal conditions. This is in no way liberal freedom. Because, again, these people have not been exposed to the same cultural conditions that we in the West have been exposed to. I mean, so for example, I mean, Muslims don't believe that human beings were created in the image and likeness of God. They don't believe, they think that is a blasphemous statement. And I was listening to a Catholic theologian talk, and he was talking to an Islamic scholar, and the Islamic scholar found this horrifying, that you would dare say that human beings were created in the image and likeness of God. This was an insult to God, because God is so above our own understanding. God is so above our own being. How could you dare say we're created in his image and likeness? And that has huge implications for how you view politics, how you treat other people, how you organize society. It's the same thing with the classical world. Okay, sure, the Greek gods were human. They were human form, they had very human appetites, right? But they looked at human beings, if you read the classical myths, they look at human beings at best with contempt. I mean, it would be terrifying to live in a world where the Greek gods existed. Because, I mean, Holland goes into this. I mean, they're constantly raping women. They're constantly just killing people. Look at you look at something like Prometheus, the myth of Prometheus. It's not like in the Genesis story where humans are perfectly content and happy. And they rebel against God. In this, humans are just kind of, as far as I understand, I could be wrong about this, but as far as I understand that myth, human beings are kind of squabbling in darkness, and Prometheus brings them fire, and Zeus is angry at this. This idea that how dare humans be happy, because they just don't care about human happiness. This is something that is very unique to Christianity. And it seems to me that we're in this very bizarre paradox where, the left today hyper emphasizes certain Christian views on egalitarianism. So they'll take egalitarianism to this level that, even though I think egalitarianism sort of starts with Christianity, they will take it to this level that just no reasonable Christian would take it to. I mean, no Christian, I think, can be an egalitarian in a Rousseauian sense. Can be an egalitarian where we have to organize society where everyone gets equal property. We organize society where there are no social distinctions between people. Because listen, obviously traditional Christianity has hierarchy. And there is a sense of good and evil. There's a sense of virtue and less virtue in Christianity, even though there is that egalitarian ethic. So, the leftists will hyper-emphasize this egalitarianism. At the same time, they cut themselves off from the roots of that egalitarianism. So their egalitarianism doesn't even have any sort of coherent basis to it. So I think that's the kind of weird paradox leftism is going to start to find itself. It on the one hand hyper emphasizes certain Christian values of egalitarianism, caring for the poor, liberty. It hyper emphasizes these things in a way that traditional Christianity never did. But at the same time, it alienates itself from a Christian metaphysic, and there's really nothing there. There's nothing. Personally, I've yet to see a compelling argument from a leftist as to why all human beings should be treated fairly, and and that we shouldn't just throw the weak out on the streets. I mean, I'd agree with them, but I think their justification for this is very weak and appeals to kind of emotional sentimentality. Oh, we obviously all want us to be together in a brotherhood of man. I don't think so. I don't think that's, just logically, I don't think it's coherent. And B, if you look at cultures around the world and throughout history, it is true that people do not want to be in a brotherhood of man. It's simply not true. Societies have often been very tribal and often looked down on other tribes. So, again, it's kind of a long tirade, but I just think, Tom Holland is just such a fascinating historian, and I just think that I'll definitely try to pick up his book when I get a chance. But definitely, if you're, I think if you're secular, if you're on the left and you're on the secular left, I would consider his arguments very carefully.